To break your guard, all he has to do is throw a fake punch. As your hand rockets forward, he pulls his hand back. Suddenly, your face is exposed and vulnerable, allowing him to target it with other punches. To prevent such an outcome, move your hand in front of your face and let the punch come to it instead of the other way around. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to parry your opponent's jab using your rear hand and then follow up with a counter cross. The primary difference here is that instead of parrying my opponent's fist to the outside of my head, I use my rear hand to parry his fist downward. Not only does this redirect his punch and zap its power, but it also creates a pathway for me to throw my parrying hand over his arm and land across. It is important to notice that I am not parrying his punch, pulling my hand back into my stance, and then throwing the cross. I throw the cross immediately after parrying his fist downward. If you hesitate between these two actions, your opponent will be able to pull his arm back into his stance to protect his face. In previous sequences, I demonstrated how to utilize a rear parry to evade your opponent's jab when in the same fighting stance, meaning you have the same foot forward. When you and your opponent have the opposite feet forward, the rear parry is utilized to evade a cross. Everything is done the same. The only difference is that you're parrying his rear arm instead of his lead arm. And just as when parrying the jab, you have the option of redirecting your opponent's fist to the outside of your head, which allows you to quickly counter with a jab, or redirecting it downward, which allows you to immediately throw a cross with your parrying hand. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to evade your opponent's cross using a lead parry when in the same fighting stance. To accomplish this, I simply redirect my opponent's fist away from my face, causing him to miss. Just as with all parries, it is important not to reach for your opponent's fist. Instead, you want to let his fist come to your hand. My opponent and I are in the same fighting stance, and he throws a cross at my face. To evade his cross, I utilize a lead parry. However, instead of redirecting his fist to the outside of my face, I stuff it downward. Not only does this zap the power from his punch, but it also lowers his arm and creates a pathway for me to counter with a jab. It is important to notice that I do not pull my arm back into my stance after executing the parry. I immediately lash out with a jab. If you delay, a couple of things can happen. Either your opponent will pull his arm back into his stance to protect his face from your counter-strike, or he will follow up with another strike. To perfect this technique, practice it with a partner as a drill for several minutes at a time. My opponent and I are in the same fighting stance, and I use a lead parry to evade his jab. This is a slightly more dangerous technique because instead of your action repositioning your head to the outside of your opponent's arm, it repositions your head to the inside of his arm, which makes you very vulnerable to the cross. To mitigate the risk, I immediately execute a counter jab with my parry arm. If your opponent plans to throw a jab-cross combination, which is very common, the goal is to hit him with the jab before he can send the cross out of the chamber. Not only does this hinder him from throwing the cross, but it also disrupts his rhythm, allowing you to follow your jab with more strikes. However, if you delay between the parry and throwing the jab, there is a very good chance that you will eat a secondary punch. To avoid taking damage when first starting out, I recommend always parrying with the hand opposite to the one your opponent throws. If he throws a punch with his left hand, parry it with your right hand. If he throws a punch with his right hand, parry it with your left hand. This will take you to the outside of your opponent's body and limit his ability to hit you with a secondary strike. Only after you become comfortable with this should you incorporate more advanced techniques like the one demonstrated here. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to utilize a lead parry to evade your opponent's jab when in opposite fighting stances. It is important to notice that this technique follows the general rule. My opponent throws a punch with his right hand and I parry with my left, making it a lot safer of a technique than the previous one shown. It is also important to notice that instead of parrying his punch to the outside of my body, I force it downward. Again, this zaps power from his punch and also creates a pathway to throw my parrying hand over his arm and land a jab to his face. If you delay between the parry and the punch, your opponent will pull his arm back and re-establish his guard. When your opponent attacks, it's best to evade his strike and counter with a strike of your own. For example, your opponent throws a jab, and you counter by slipping his jab and throwing a jab at the same time. If done correctly, just as your opponent's arm becomes fully extended, you crash your fist into his face. In addition to avoiding some pain and dishing some out, striking your opponent while he's in the middle of his attack breaks his rhythm, making it very difficult for him to follow up with more strikes. This allows you to go on the offensive. However, you won't always have the foot positioning needed to evade all of your opponent's strikes, making it very important to learn how to block. It can be a little risky because even when you manage to cover your head with your arms, there will still be gaps in your protective shield, and sometimes the small MMA gloves will find their way through these cracks and connect with your face or head. For this reason, it is important to use blocking as a last option. The outside block is best used to combat punches that approach from the outside, such as hooks and overhands. It's a relatively simple block in terms of movement, and when executed with the proper form and correct timing, it can effectively protect your head from strikes. But due to the small gloves used in MMA competition, it can oftentimes be risky. It's not uncommon for a punch to slip through a crevice in your protective shield and crash into the side of your face, and even when you utilize a perfect outside block, you're still absorbing the impact of the blow. A much better option is to slip or evade the strike altogether and position yourself to launch a counterattack. However, evading punches isn't always possible, especially when you're trading punches with your opponent. If slipping isn't an alternative, utilizing